Hello and welcome to this webinar on change leadership. I'm Richard Nielsen from Develop Change, and in this webinar we're going to look at your change leadership as opposed to collective leadership or strategic leadership, organisational leadership. We're not going to be touching those, they're bigger topics in their own right, but we are going to focus very much on the competency of your change leadership. Now, competency, as you're probably aware, is composed of three elements. One is the knowledge, and that includes the landscape in which we're operating in, how to read it and understand it, etc. The science of leadership and management, the psychology behind that, the applications, when to use certain techniques or not, and also finally how to develop your skill sets and your knowledge base. So that's the knowledge side, and that's going to be very much the focus of today. The other two parts are the skills required, the behaviours that we actually deploy to engage others, to build trust, to communicate, to inspire. Ultimately, how do we take people with us? And that's best developed in contact with other people, because other people act as mirrors, so we can see through their eyes how we're coming across and whether we're being effective or not. And within Kirklees, you've got some very good programs on your learning management systems which you can log on to and get involved in, but you also have coaching and you have action learning sets, and those two are extremely powerful ways of developing both your knowledge and your skills. If you wish to get involved with those, I would heartily recommend that you contact Learning Admin to discuss how you would do that. The final element, though, is something you bring to the party, and that is the will, the determination, the drive, the desire to want to do something that will make a difference. I can't provide that from here, but what I hope is within this next hour there'll be a few things there which will inspire you to either use the talents you already have or to develop those talents further. The webinar lasts about an hour, but I split it down to three sections which I think are logical, different parts or elements, and you can watch them all in one go or in separate sections depending on your preference. Part one is going to really be looking at the dynamics of human interactions and where leadership fits in. So this is the landscape, if you like, of where we operate. Part two looks at some of the differences between leadership and management and when to deploy the two, and they are quite distinct, as we'll look and explain later. Part three is about how we learn, and one of the features of the way we learn, particularly in management and leadership, is we learn skills, get to a point where we're working really well at one level, but to move on to the next level we have to start questioning some of the things we've been doing in the past and maybe unlearn some things as well as learn new things. So that's the part three, which will look at something called single and double loop learning as a foundation for where we may want to choose to move forwards. Okay. Over the last 50, 60 years or so, or maybe longer, there have been plenty of leadership writers who've tried to define the landscape in which we operate. John Adair springs to mind, who you may have heard of in the 1960s. He came up with his task team individual model to describe the area that leadership operates in, and that's great. It's great when things are stable, but unfortunately I think it's a bit too simplistic for the complexities of what happens when change is in play, and it doesn't really help us to understand what's going on with the complex dynamics associated with it. So what I'm going to try and do now is to give you a tool which allows you to create a mental map, if you like, of the landscape, taking into account the complexities that come about with change. And once we have this map, we can use it for in two ways. One is to diagnose what's actually going on, what's actually happening, so we can read the situation, but also it will allow us to navigate a way through that complexity of human dynamics with more accuracy and more chance of getting to the destination you intended rather than somewhere else. So that's the model I'm going to describe now. Right, this model is one I've been using for the last 30 years as a consultant, and it really underpins a lot of my work in that sphere. But also as a leader and as a manager, it's helpful as well because it looks at where my focus should be and all the things that might be within my remit. So I'm going to build it because there's a lot of information. It makes it clear if I do build it. So this is the basic model. It's a hierarchical triangular model, and if you look at it by what I mean by hierarchical is that the things below affect the things above. But right at the very top is the overarching purpose of the organisation, why it exists in the first place. And it's something I always ask clients to reflect on when I first start working with them, because that purpose may have happened or began many years ago, decades ago. And it's important to just check in once in a while to make sure we're clear why we exist. And just some examples there, it's fairly obvious which one would apply to Kirklees Council. You're not a police force, for example, you're not the army or anything like that. So you are there to provide services to society. And that purpose is what should be the real driving force, because that is why you exist. What those services are, well, it can be anything from children's social care to adult social care, to highways, to libraries, to school support services. I don't know, you've got a whole list of those. But when you have multiple subsets of purpose, it's very important to clarify the priorities. And I'm sure during the last 2 or 3 years of pandemic and all the rest of the cutbacks you've had from government funding, you've been having to do that multiple times. But by being really clear, it helps you decide which are the things that really matter and which are the things that perhaps are lower down that chain. And maybe when cuts have to be made, sadly they're the areas which you would cut first rather than your prime services. But when I go into an organisation as a consultant, the first question I will ask is, why do you exist? Tell me about it. And if I get any sense that it's muddled, then that's where I would start to do any work. I'll give you an example of how muddling can happen. The BBC has a similar purpose to yourselves. The BBC began to provide a public service, but in recent years, and again with budgetary and financial constraints, it's also had to become a profit centre and to make money as well. Now that can cause tensions within the organisations, and if we're not careful, we lose track of why we're actually existing. The purpose will determine what we do. So if it's looking at children's services, it's about interventions with families, it's about prevention as much as possible, but also dealing with difficulties that families might have. So the purpose defines what we do, and you employ social workers and support staff to make sure that can happen. Below that are these things called procedures in bold, and these are the ways we go about achieving the task. And below that are the people processes, but I shall elaborate on those in a moment. So the formal procedures, this is the way the organisation declares it will achieve its aim, and that can be everything from how we structure ourselves as an organisation. And by the way, I'm not talking about the small one man or one woman business. I'm not talking about a little family enterprise with just a few people. We're talking about multiple people working for the organisation. And once you get multiple people, you have to organise people into different roles. You have different layers, for example, of management. These are things which are the way we say we're going to deliver the task. However, and this is a big however, the way complex organisations work means that we can't possibly document every single process or procedure and have everybody follow it, because the world is complex. It's too complex, and people are complex as well. So what actually happens may be different to what's supposed to happen, and usually that's fairly okay. That's precisely what happens in the real world situation. The procedure said we do X, Y, and Z in this order, but reality means we have to make a decision quickly, and we haven't necessarily got all that information to hand before we need to make a decision. But we make a decision by maybe popping over to somebody else's desk, the manager's desk perhaps, and checking out and so on, and finding out if it's okay to go ahead. Or We may empower our people to make an informed decision based on their judgment, their professional judgment, to make a decision and then complete the bits that were missing when they get back to the office. And that certainly happens a lot with frontline workers. And that amount of trust that we give people to make those decisions is make or break for the organisation's effectiveness. Moving further down, we have the quality of relationships between people. Now, this is where I mentioned earlier that this is a hierarchical model. Those of you long enough in the tooth to remember the bad old days of the 1970s and 80s when there was lots of industrial relations issues in this country, you may recall that for much of the time, the workers, when they were in dispute with the management, didn't actually go on strike that often. What they did first was work to rule. And when people work to rule, doing the things that are formally laid down, what used to happen in most cases was the organisation would start to grind to a halt. It had pretty well the same effect as a strike would have. And that's particularly in the case where we have organisations with a high safety element. So the railways, for example, will gradually wind down once people stop doing the informal things that were necessary to support the formal procedures, because safety rules say you cannot run a train if you're not sure that it's gone, onto a particular section of track. So the informal procedures are really important. In all my experience of working with organisations, large, small, across a huge range of different sectors, I've never found one that has produced formal procedures so precise that the organisation will run itself just by following those procedures. They all require the informal procedures to support them. And I've mentioned the relationships because if the relationships are good, people will make those informal procedures happen. But as in the 1980s, once the relationships break down between people, then the informal procedures tend to suffer as well. And as a result, the task achieved by the organisation is diminished at best, and at worst isn't possible. It just doesn't deliver. And the quality of relationships are determined by, right at the very bottom of this model, the individual people who make up your organisation. And individual people join your organisation to meet, first and foremost, their needs, which might be financial. I've got a house and a mortgage or a rent to pay, but it might also be about more personal things like I want to feel I'm contributing to society. And certainly within your type of organisation's purpose, you probably have a lot of those people who are there because it's a vocation. They want to make a difference to their community, to their society. So individual needs vary. We all bring something different to the party, and interestingly, the individual's needs change over time. So as a young, free, single man, my needs were quite different to when a few years later, I had a family to support, and the financial things mattered certainly a lot more once that happened. So needs are different for each individual person, and the other things on there I've put on are feelings, attitudes, beliefs and values. People come to an organisation with a feeling that they will satisfy those other things as well, and people migrate to the kind of organisation that they're interested in being part of. So if we were interested in just making money and stuff everybody else, I certainly wouldn't be coming to work for a council. I'd probably go and work for a betting shop or maybe something different. But those personal needs, feelings, attitudes, beliefs and values are all different, but tend to find a home in the organisation that has the best fit, and there'll never be a perfect fit. And as I said, also with time things may change, but that's the basic organisational structure. And as I've mentioned, key points from it: it's hierarchical. Things below always affect the things above, and what we need to do is use this tool to assess where we put our focus to make sure that things don't start to go out of kilter and start to break down. Okay, taking this model further, if you can visualize it sat in a bath of water, what you would see is things above the waterline would be the formal procedures and the task and your purpose. That's all declared in the public arena. And if I go onto your website, I can even find out how you organize yourselves. I can see the organization chart. I can see individual managers' roles if I dig down deep enough. I can probably find out how you go about certainly some of your governance work, such as children and adult services. There's a lot of information there. Because of visible, easy to access, tangible, hard data, it's easier to talk about those things. However, below the waterline, what we see there are things which are really vitally important to the organisation, but they're not as clear. I cannot see what informal procedures have to be undertaken to make the formal stuff work. I cannot detect the quality of relationships that easy, certainly not just by walking through a building. And I cannot check out what individual needs are being met and what are not being met, and what people feel about their work. All of that is less tangible. It tends to be private as well. People are very professional and don't share that necessarily with an outsider unless somebody's given them permission to do so. But those things are nevertheless there, but we just can't see them or talk about them as easily as the stuff above the waterline. Now, in organisations, I've said before, the way we organise ourselves in a declared, stated way is never sufficient. And what that tends to do is means there's always some tension, a healthy tension actually, between what should happen and what actually happens. And that healthy tension, I call it healthy because if people talk about it, then that drives improvement. People say, this isn't working because this new form I have to fill in on the computer doesn't make it easy for me to go back and correct a mistake, for example. By talking about that, we can improve it, we can do it better. And that is where, in all organisations, the tension should lie. If it's happening elsewhere, if those tensions are occurring elsewhere, then they may be symptomatic of some of the things that management and leadership are getting wrong. And one of my roles as a consultant is to go and ask questions like, what works well for you? What frustrates you about your job? What hinders you from actually delivering the things you've set out to deliver? And by asking those sorts of questions with permission from the organisation's management, I can find out a lot of the things that really are in need of being addressed. Now, organisations can bring consultants in to find that stuff out, but you can also do that yourself. As a manager and as a leader, if we ask those questions and give people a safe space to have a discussion about them, we can find out a whole load of stuff about how the organisation works and what's working well and what's not working so well. So if you bear this model in mind in terms of an iceberg, it tells you something about where we should put our focus. And I'm going to move on to that next and just look at where leadership and management sits in this model. Okay, I've stripped away some of the things from the last slide, but just left the iceberg effect still there, showing where the waterline is and things above and below, which we know are either more or less easy to discuss. I've also left the layer of tension there, the healthy tension that exists between the formal declared ways of doing things and what actually happens. But I've added the big E now in the left there, and that big E represents the external environment in which the organisation operates. It's ever present, it's totally outside the organisation's control, and it can bring with it a whole raft of things like changes around technology, environmental factors, financial, political, etc. So all these things impinge on the organisation, and it's also probably the reason why the organisation was created in the first place. But the external environment doesn't sit still. It's changing, evolving all the time, and the organisation therefore needs to take heed of that and be prepared to change itself in response to those external changes. And it's all very well looking back and yearning for how it used to be in the council 10 years ago. It's irrelevant. The world has changed, it's moved on. And organisations that fail to recognise those changes and do something about it with the things that they can control are doomed to failure eventually. They'll become irrelevant at worst, or they'll go bust as well. So where things sit in terms of management and leadership, I would suggest that management traditionally concentrated on the things above the waterline. And when the external world was perhaps more benign and not changing as much as it's doing now, that was fine. We could organise ourselves in a certain way, and that would work with that stability. But in a rapid changing world, that doesn't work as well. So we also have leadership, and leadership has a much broader scope. Leadership covers not just the task and the purpose, but right down into the relationships and the people processes. So leadership has a much broader span. And again, going back to that time, or if there ever was a time when organisations were in a more benign world, we often separated out management and leadership. Leadership was probably left to people higher up, and we had managers with various grades managing their part of the formal stuff as well. But nowadays, I think most organisations that I come across, we have both managers and leaders, and we have managers who are expected to be leaders and leaders who are expected to manage. We don't tend to carve them up as separate roles anymore, although interestingly many organisations still talk about leadership as being the prerogative of more senior managers, and less is expected perhaps of more junior managers. That's an interesting take, but I'm working on the premise that managers have to be good leaders, and leaders also have to be good managers. We need both skill sets, and we'll expand on that and what the differences are a little bit later. The other bit I want to just add on to the model now is the culture of the organisation. The culture of the organisation is the interaction between the formal ways we do the work in hand and the people things. It's that combination of how they interact. So people bring all their attitudes, beliefs and values. The organisation creates ways of doing the job, and that interaction gives us the culture. Cultures aren't fixed, they're dynamic, but cultures also can actually influence new people coming in. It's a very brave person who starts a new job and starts to do things differently to the way all their peers are doing things. So the culture can affect the way individuals behave, but collectively and over time, the people can affect the culture. And perhaps the people most able to affect the culture are the leaders. And I don't say the managers, I say the leaders here intentionally. Management can only change the formal bits, procedures of how we do the job, whereas leadership can influence the informal procedures, and it's there where the biggest impact comes. So I would assert that the culture of the organisation, the leadership team collectively, and that includes frontline leaders right the way up to senior leaders, collectively leaders are the guardians of culture, and it's they who maintain it, and it's they who can change it most easily. People as a whole, and I'm talking here about all the employees of the organisation, can also have an impact on culture. And going back to the 1980s, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of bottom-up pressure to change cultures in organisations, and the culture we got in the 1980s as a result were quite different to perhaps the culture we have now in the 2020s. The culture or subcultures, and I put the word subcultures in there, is because we get those as a result of the interactions as I've just described. We might get subcultures between different departments, and you can look across your own council and see where the cultures have similarities but also differences. And it's important to be aware of what those cultures are. The shared beliefs in one department might be slightly different to the shared beliefs in another department, and that will affect the relationships and therefore the informal procedures and ultimately the task in hand. So culture, leadership and management are the three territories or parts of the landscape that you guys, whether you've got leadership or management in your title or not, doesn't matter. These are the areas that you should be really interested in, and we can use this model as a diagnostic to see perhaps where things aren't going as they should do and where we need to focus attention. Bearing in mind, in a healthy organisation, most of that effort should just be making the informal procedures match up by improving the formal procedures. It should be that area where that healthy tension lies. But we'll look at some other examples to see what else can happen. So in the model, when we have the external world presenting changes against the organisation, something has to happen within the organisation, otherwise it will lose its relevance, and or if it's a commercial organisation, will go bust. So change needs to happen inside as a result of what's happening outside. And when that happens, I'm going to use the word management here in the traditional sense, that it's the management that's really only concerned with the task and the formal declared ways of doing things. But the traditional response in many organisations, including councils, has been to impose top-down change as a result of the external things happening outside. So, for example, they may change the tasks we do, they may change the amount of money they allocate, they may change the leadership structure or management structure. All those changes are a typical response to old-style organisations to external change. And I say old-style, we still need some top-down change anyway, I would suggest, in all organisations at times, because organisations don't necessarily change quickly enough if it's left to other methods. But let's just look at this example of what happens when it's just top-down change only, with little consultation or involvement or leadership involved in that process. That pressure on changes to the formal procedures immediately has an effect on the informal procedures. The workarounds, the habits and behaviours which we've developed over the years to make the existing formal procedures work suddenly become less effective, given we've changed some of the rules, if you like. We've changed the game that we're operating in. And that starts to put pressure on the relationships. People suddenly find themselves having to do more work or a different kind of work to what they've been used to. They may find that the help they get from people in other departments is no longer there because the route to access that help has perhaps disappeared. Maybe we've been relocated to different offices. We're not sat next to the people we used to sit next to, for example. And ultimately, that pressure gets right down to the individual. People who joined the council 20 years ago may start saying, this isn't the council I joined, this isn't what I signed up for, this isn't what I believe in. We should be doing something like we were doing 20 years ago, not what you're proposing to do now. So that top-down pressure starts to impact in all those areas below the waterline. And because it's below the waterline, we don't necessarily see it unless we're really, really looking out for it. We don't see the impact of that. But what it does tend to do, it tends to create an opposite reaction. And the opposite reaction is in the form of resistance to change. Yes, we ask people to make a change, but do they actually do it? Do people still just plod on with their old ways of doing things and hang in there, trying to do it as they've always done, rather than adopting the new styles and ways of working? Classic examples I've seen over time is people still doing things manually when they've got a computer system which would do it for them, and still insisting on writing lots of paperwork and so on. Thankfully, a lot of that has gone now, as that generation, our generation, if you're my age, is becoming fewer and fewer in organisations. We've seen less of that, and the young people are much more digital savvy perhaps than we are. So that resistance to change pushes back. So what the management is trying to achieve is now facing resistance. And as a result of that, we tend to then move those areas of tension from the healthy area between the formal and informal procedures down into relationships and ultimately down to the individuals. And that's when we start to see unions getting involved. We see things in the press where the unions are outraged by X, Y, and Z change. It's unhealthy when it gets to this stage. And I would suggest for all of us as managers and leaders, in the new sense of the term, not the old demarked sense of the past, but for us managers and us leaders today, we need to be aware when this is happening. And there are times when top-down change is necessary, but it will always create resistance and it will always create those tensions, and we need to be aware of those and prepared to deal with them. In the first part of this webinar, we looked at a very simple organisational model which gives us, if you like, the map of the landscape in which leaders and managers operate. And we broke that down into a number of things, looking at the layers and the interactions between the layers, but most importantly the message that the things lower down in the organisation, which are hidden below the water level, actually have a massive impact on our ability or the organisation's ability to deliver its purpose. And we talked about briefly management and leadership and where they fit within this model. But what I'm going to do next is look a little bit more about those two tools, leadership and management, and see how they differ, but then also how they both can use a response to change that's positive and actually leads to better results. So that's what we're going to look at now. In the previous section, I talked about the differences between management and leadership, and just as a reminder of the words there, the management activities tend to be those concerned with things above the waterline in that iceberg model, the formal procedures, the task itself. And leadership is the opposite. It's about primarily focusing on the things below that waterline, so the people, processes, relationships, culture, engagement, motivation of the individuals, and so on. I also said in that section that most of us tend to conflate the two words. We use them interchangeably, and certainly that is the case with job descriptions. But most people, I would suggest, in positions of responsibility within organisations have to do both. We have to do both management tasks and we have to do leadership tasks. But we need to make sure we get that balance right. So this is where this old time management concept comes in, which I've mentioned on the screen. Maintenance activities versus progress activities. Maintenance activities, if I use the car analogy, are things like filling it up with fuel, topping up the windscreen wash, and having it serviced annually and having it MOT'd. We do all those things to keep it moving. If we don't do them, it will soon break down on us and it won't be any use to us. But by doing them, we don't end up with a better car. We don't get to our destinations quicker or safer or whatever. Whereas progress activities, to use that car analogy, would be having the engine remapped to make it go faster, or to use less fuel, or to have more power on hills, if we're towing a car, for example. So by reprogramming the computer, it will become a better vehicle, or better suited for our needs. It might also include swapping that vehicle for another model. So as a family grows, we may want more room for the expanding family in the back seat. So buying a different car could be described as a progress activity. But in the work context, maintenance activities are those things which just maintain the systems, the governance, all those side of things which have to be done, but don't necessarily make the council's work more effective or better. Progress activities in that context would be the difference between training people for the current role, which is a maintenance activity, as opposed to developing staff for a role or a future role that's coming up on the horizon. So we're investing time in them. There's no direct link that it will deliver, but by investing that time in some of the individuals in your team, hopefully all of the individuals, we will end up getting a team that's more capable either of dealing with the change that's forthcoming or to perhaps increase our capacity as well, if there's more people who can do certain tasks than we have currently, for example. It's also useful in terms of career progression. So as you want to develop and move perhaps up to take on more responsibility, then developing somebody in your team who can step into your boots would be a clear example of a progress task. And what I would suggest is we need to, as leaders and managers, is look at that balance and ask, are we getting the balance right? One of the things we can do is through delegation, we can give parts of our job to the team, and that frees up our time to do more progress activities, but it's a progress activity in itself, because by developing somebody, we now have more capability in the team. So as I said, it's worthwhile just looking at the balance between your time allocation and seeing where you spend your time. As on the previous slide, the words change management and change leadership tend to be conflated and used interchangeably, when in fact they are two quite separate disciplines. but not mutually exclusive. We need both of these, and it depends on the nature of the change. But the way to describe the differences is just by comparing and contrasting. So change management is concerned primarily with systems, processes, tools and mechanisms, whereas change leadership is more about the vision, the narratives, energy, motivation, and at that high level those differences are quite fundamental. We also tend to see under change management more concentration on efficiencies, doing things well rather than doing the right things necessarily, and ideally it should be the right things, but sometimes we program in changes because, for example, computers eventually become outdated and we need to replace them. Under change leadership it might be questioning, do we need computer systems at all, or are we better going to web-based systems or something like that? It would be that fundamental step change that would be different. And it's also, I think, fair to say that with change leadership, because the focus is more on effectiveness, that's the achievement of outcomes, it tends to be more tolerant of not having necessarily the clearest of plans in terms of detail. So the efficiency would want every single step mapped out under the change management side, whereas change leadership might be prepared to just say, well, we'll work out those minor steps on the way when we get to them, but the big goal is the major step. And by having that focus on the end point rather than on the actual detail of the journey, that to me would differentiate change management from change leadership. Change management will map out all the single steps in every level of detail with very strong project management around it. Change management also tends to focus on transitional change or incremental changes rather than transformational change. So lots of small steps in bite-sized pieces would be the way change management works, whereas change leadership might grasp the iron and say, right, we're going to drop this all together and just skip all the intermediate stages, we're going to go for the next level up altogether. The difference in terms of who drives and who owns is also quite apparent between the two. So change management tends to be top driven. There's usually a project group with a project manager who is often a senior board level person. You may in your council context actually have a councillor as the project lead as well. Whereas change leadership tends to be, yes, top driven, but also driven by leaders at all levels. So one of the things about transformational changes, it can't just be delivered by one or two strong voices at the top. We need to engage leaders at every single level. So we have champions throughout the organisation and in each department or each part of the organisation. I would also say that change management, a feature would be risk averse. If it can't be planned and can't be mitigated, then we don't do it. So it tends to stay in the safe area. We don't want to risk losing customers or upsetting customers, whereas change leadership is much more risk aware. We know that we might upset certain members of our staff team by doing something X, Y or Z, but we are prepared to take that gamble because we know if we can get it through, we will end up in a better place. So risk averse versus risk aware is a big distinction between the two. Change management is also about controlling and making things happen, whereas change leadership I would describe as empowering people and making them want the change to happen. So one is more of a pull style, the other is a push style. So some quite fundamental differences there, but as I said, we use the words interchangeably, and with good change leadership, we probably also need to have some change management going on as well for the bits that we can control. But as I said, it's also risk aware, and we may decide to skip all of that and just let that sort itself out with time, and that does happen. Okay, those of you who have attended management programs or maybe Googled, change leadership is a huge topic area. I think when I last looked, over 700 million hits on Google. There are also lots of academic authors and gurus who've come up with models for change leadership, and you can start with Kurt Lewin or Lewin. McKinsey's have a 7S model. We've also got Kotter and people like that, but those models tend not to be things which are easy to apply. So I'm going to offer this one. This was a model created by a colleague of mine many years ago when we were working on some massive change programs within the steel industry, and he came up with a very simple 3-step model. And he said great leaders can be characterized as setting direction, creating a vision, if you like, something that people can get behind and rally behind. But setting direction by leading by example, so not asking people to do something you weren't prepared to do yourself, but not just having that caveat, but also walking the talk and demonstrating the new behaviors that you want people to adopt. For example, it needs to be there 100% all the time. And the final part is taking others with you. So it's a very simple model, and it's about doing the right things, not just the easy things. It's about doing and being noticed by doing. You can't have leadership if you're behind a closed door and people can't see you. And emails certainly don't cut it. And I would say even in the digital world, Zoom leadership still lacks some of that direct contact that you feel when you see and have a conversation with a person face to face. So I would commend this as a face-to-face activity. Zoom, yes, is your next best bet, but certainly leadership isn't something that's done by edict or emails. You need to be noticed and felt. And the final bit on that middle strand is not just doing the right things, but being noticed and being believed. So there's something about your authenticity which needs to come through there. If you are reading off a script or reading somebody else's vision rather than something you are passionate about yourself, that will be seen straight through. So the authenticity is really important, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but there are some characteristics. There's no one set way of doing these things, but there are some common characteristics which I will describe in the next slide. Over my career, I've spent quite a lot of time working with or alongside some really great change leaders, and also I've come across a few which haven't been so good either as well. But from that personal experience, I've come up with this list here which I think are some of the key characteristics that I've seen, regardless of the people, the industry, the sector, if you like. These seem to shine through as common characteristics between the different leaders. And I'm not going to go through each item on the list there, you can read them yourself, but I'm going to pick out just a few of them. I'll pick out 3 which I think are really, really critical, and you can draw your own conclusions. The first one is the one I mentioned in the last slide, which is about being authentic. Nobody likes a plastic manager, somebody who's been on a course and come back and thinks they're the bee's knees, and they're just trying to produce something because it's, they've read it in a book or seen somebody else doing it. The best leaders are the ones who are authentic and being themselves and aware of their own strengths, but also aware of their own weaknesses. And usually underplaying the strengths is a characteristic I've seen. I would also say the next most important one is the enthusiasm. And if you aren't passionate, how on earth are you going to take people with you? If you don't believe in something, you're not going to really fire up other people's enthusiasm. And remember, change leadership is about pulling people with you, not forcing them and pushing it onto them. So if you're not enthusiastic and have a real belief and some drive and energy behind what you're wanting people to do, then that's unlikely to work for other people. The final one is self-belief, and it might be a deep-seated inner belief that what we're trying to do is the right thing, the better approach, the way we should be doing things around here. If you've got that inner belief, again, that will feed through into your enthusiasm, and people will get it, they'll see that. But what I would add as a caveat, many of the leaders I've seen also are racked with self-doubt, and some of them actually think of themselves as being imposters. So if you're in that boat, you're probably in the right sort of area. So that countervailing force of self-doubt against the self-belief is probably not a bad place to be. People tend to underrate their skills, but the people around them will rate them highly. So I think these three, the authenticity, the enthusiasm, and the self-belief are the three key ones, but there are others up there as well. Emotional intelligence will probably be my next best bet. That's awareness of self and awareness of others at the foundations is behind emotional intelligence. So what you can do is you can use this list as a bit of a checklist, and if you want to develop your own skills in this area, your own competence as a change leader, just have a look down there and just give yourself a score out of 10 against each one, and that might tell you something about where you need to focus your attention. In the next slide, I'm going to be talking about those levers I mentioned earlier, and these are some of the things we can actually do now as levers and utilize to bring about change. So I'm going to move on to that as the next stage. A former colleague of mine by the name of Eric Clubley introduced me to this concept of change leadership levers. We're all familiar with how a lever works. We get more effect from our efforts if we use a long rod over a fulcrum. But in the context of change leadership, what he said was there are certain things that we do, for example, around our interpersonal touch points, where communication, engagement and peer pressure, if we use the things within those headings to maximize the impact we have on the situation, we will get more for our efforts. And he talked about structural and procedural ones as well, which are things that were within our control that we can alter about how we go about doing the job, if you like, the formal procedures and structures and systems and so on. And there are things we can do there. The final areas within ourselves, and some of those are around our own self-belief, but it's also around our competence, and we can change those and again get more effect for our efforts. So the next slide I'll talk in detail about how we can use levers and some ideas for you to deploy. When Eric and I used to run change leadership programs with managers in big companies, we used to use these 5 particular levers as examples. We didn't do action planning as such. What we did was we got groups to go around flip charts with one of these headings on each flip chart, and they just brainstormed ideas amongst themselves as to what they could do under each of those 5 headings. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but because you get the gist of this, I'm sure. But if you are in a position where some of the more structural things, the formal procedures, can be changed and you've got the ability to do that, then look at those. And what we will know is, from where we are now, what's causing the issues and the problems, what's holding us back, where we want to be and what we want to be doing differently. When you look at those things there, the direction, the policies, procedures, the ways we communicate and so on, I'm sure you'll find lots of ideas to bring about changes. And even if you're not high enough in the hierarchy of the council to change some of the policies and procedures, what can you do with your own communications with your own teams, your team meetings and so on? Can you change the agendas, the structure, the way you go about those things? But there's plenty there, I'm sure, that you can find in those areas. Doing things symbolically, this is really something to consider. I think it's about doing things which are unexpected, which get people's attention, because that's never happened before. Inviting the chief exec to come and do a briefing with your team. Gosh, that would be powerful, wouldn't it, if she could come down and do that. It's your own leadership actions. It's getting there. You know, if you've got people at the front line running a help centre or something like that, go and join them for a shift. You know, spend a few hours on the front line with them. But whilst they're not talking to the customers, your clients, talk to them and get them fired up with your enthusiasm for the changes that you're trying to bring around. Whatever it is, the more unexpected it is, the more impact it will have, and the more visible that change will become to the people who are expected to follow it. Engagement, My mantra, which I use a lot, is that leadership is a contact sport, and I fully believe that. I don't think it's something we can do by emails or by telephone. Zoom has to be a sort of next best option. I know when we've had the pandemic, we've had to use that a lot, but there's nothing to beat getting eyeball to eyeball with somebody so they can share your sense of passion and enthusiasm, but also to ask what they think and to find what they're worried about and concerned about, and to deal with their concerns and to take them on board. So that means listening, but face to face is your most powerful tool as a leader, I would suggest. Empowerment is also important as well for engaging people. By empowering, it's about letting go of something. You can't hold on to something and then tell them to make their own decisions if they're then going to come back and check in with you. Give them some real empowerment to go and do things, and recognize that if they're doing things for the first time, they may likely make mistakes. So think about how you will help them through those mistakes. Don't jump on them like a ton of bricks, but get them to work through and what could they do differently next time to get it right. So that engagement is really important. Recognition and reward. Just saying thank you is so important. We can do that ourselves, and we should be doing that, but that means getting out there and noticing when people are doing things right. So again, dedicating less time perhaps to the maintenance activities and more time to going out and seeing people. That could be something you want to consider doing. Use public recognition where the team has excelled or achieved what they were meant to achieve within a shorter time frame, for example. All of that's really powerful, as is getting your boss or your boss's boss to come down. That is really symbolic, as well as giving that recognition. The final one is the peer pressure, and you will know who your key influencers are, and if you can get those people on board and share your passion with them, they will then act as an ambassador for whatever the cause is. So I think it's really important to know the key influencers and know how to get them on board, and if you can change the habits of one or two of those people, that will be noticed by perhaps more junior, less confident people in the team as well, and they will start to adopt those habits and behaviours. But the flip side is, if you see people doing the wrong things, then challenge that behaviour and use the opposite to the reward and recognition. Do it privately first of all, but just say that was not appropriate, that's doing it the old way, we're dropping that now, this is the way we're doing it. Pick people up as and when you see them doing things wrong, because if you don't do that, you're effectively condoning it. Okay, so that's the way we can use those levers. And remember, a lever is something which multiplies the force and effort you're putting in. So these things, if done well, will give you more bangs for your buck, and you can come up with your own ideas that fit your own context, I'm sure. The next section, we're going to look at single versus double loop learning, and it's the final part of this webinar. In this final short session, I want to talk about single versus double loop learning. There's a bit of jargon there, and I will explain what those mean in some depth in a moment. But learning in this context applies at several levels. It applies to me as an individual, just as a human being, because I am constantly, or should be constantly, learning and growing and developing. But it also applies to me as a leader or as a manager. But it also applies to my team, to my service area or department if I work in one, and it applies at the level of the organisation as a whole. Clearly the first two, me as an individual and me as a leader, I can definitely do something about that because I'm in control of that, or should be. When it gets to the organisation, it becomes more difficult there because we're talking about collective learning, and that's a challenge for all of you guys as leaders and managers within Kirklees as to how to ensure that the organisation is learning and growing. But I will explain what the two different parts are, and hopefully from that you'll then be able to see how maybe we need to sometimes look and see the world differently if we're going to progress in our learning and development. So I'll move on now to explain first of all what single loop learning is. Single loop learning is the classic plan, do, check, act cycle, where we set out to do something, we do it, we then look back at how we did it, and if it can be improved, we do it differently and try again. And that cycle is something which I'm sure all of you as managers are very familiar with. And I've given an example there. So as a leader, if I run meetings, I notice how they run, I notice what's going well, I listen to the feedback. If people feel that it wasn't the appropriate content that we looked at in the meeting, they'll tell me, and I can do something about it. So I become clear about my objectives. As a result of that, I create a better agenda, and I do things like make sure people have time to prepare and they know exactly what they're coming to contribute and so on. So the result is, the outcome is, I get a better meeting, and I should always be doing that, and that goes part and parcel with every manager and leader's job. Although surprisingly, not every person does that, and we do have some people who constantly wonder why they're constantly getting the same results, but they're always doing the same things and they don't see the connection sometimes. So that's an example of a single loop learning process. It's a cycle of improvement, continuous improvement. We should all be continuously improving what we do, and that virtuous cycle of plan, do, check, act is something we should be doing all the time. But what we should be doing perhaps occasionally is just stopping and reflecting at a more deeper level by challenging our assumptions. So in that analogy of the meeting, ask the question, do I need the meeting? What are the critical outcomes that this meeting is meant to achieve? What happens differently as a result of the meeting? Those sorts of questions make us consider the whole question about the meeting's purpose, and that, if we listen to the answers that we come up with, that might reveal some very interesting points that we need to consider. Once I've raised my awareness of my assumptions, I can then start to think of some alternative leadership interactions in this case. So I might decide that I can organise a different kind of meeting, or I can just drop the meeting altogether and replace it with some other activities which do the same, create the same effect. I could devolve ownership of the meeting and step outside of it altogether, and that frees up a lot of my time. So the double loop learning, once we start getting into that, challenging our assumptions, our basic assumptions or premises for the way we do things now, we can question what we do now and perhaps move on to better things.
If single loop learning is something we should be doing all the time, we just need to make sure as leaders and managers that we make space for that reflection and that plan, do, check, act cycle. If we do that, we can make sure we do things right in the organisation. The double loop learning is something we should be doing periodically. It isn't something we should be doing all the time, every day, but it's about stepping back once in a while and questioning what we're doing and why we're doing it. And from that, we might start to see things which we can do differently and better. And it's about doing the right things, not just doing things well. To get to that point, though, we've got barriers to overcome, and some of the barriers are internal. We have our own ways of seeing the world, our own personal bias on how we perceive things, and that's an interesting area to get into, to recognise what those might be. We also have mindsets, and those mindsets are very convenient ways of making life easier. We get on with things because this is how we frame the world around us. But by checking those out and questioning those potential barriers, we may see some radically different ways of doing things, and that should be the goal of every leader. So in the next slide, I'm just going to show a few examples of perhaps some of the questions we need to ask, and I'll say in the final slide about where we might want to ask those questions. But if we just move on, I'll show you what the questions are.
Right, so that is the end of the webinar content at this stage. What I'd like to do is just leave you now with some key points to reflect on. And the 6 points are: where's your balance between management and leadership? What are your leadership touch points, in other words, the levers, and are you using them effectively? Is your leadership activity visible, noticed and believed by those you lead, and how would you know? Are there any assumptions, beliefs, mindsets or biases that are preventing you from objectively assessing your effectiveness? You could use the list of characteristics of effective change leaders to assess your current strengths and to identify if there are any gaps. But the final point is, what steps do you now think you could take to further develop your change leadership? And I'm thinking here particularly of those tools that will help you address the underlying assumptions and beliefs that underpin the way you are currently operating. So in other words, what are the means of doing that double loop learning? And I'm thinking here probably of looking at coaching, action learning sets, and any other activities you can do with other people where you are prepared to challenge each other to get underneath the skin of what you're currently doing. Anyway, I hope that's provided a little bit of inspiration and will help you with your next part of your development journey. Thank you very much.